I built a new Hero Factory mock where I revamped the set Stormer and made him look like he's a part of the awesome Ice Planet LEGO theme. In this video, let me show you some instructions for some areas of the mock, as well as walk you through my inspirations, building process, photography process, and much more. Let's dive in. So it's Hero February, so I had to build something Hero Factory related in this month. Now, early on, this mock began as something fairly different to what it ended up being. When doing research for what I wanted to build, I came across this image, and I just love the idea of a bulky, armored sci-fi cop. It just seemed kind of somewhat fitting for Hero Factory, really. I mean, they basically are sci-fi cops to a degree, so I thought it was a nice combo. I also saw this image and I really liked the idea of these shoulder gun cannon things that this mech has here. So I wanted to make sure right off the bat that I put those in some fashion. So with all of that, I got stuck into building, and here's a nice work in progress photo when this mock was just a torso and some arms. Now, obviously you can see that the bulky suit look was starting to form, and I was pretty happy with that. But at the time, I wanted this mock to just purely be white with little sort of subtle black accents. I didn't actually have any remote idea that I'd be playing with this Ice Planet color scheme that was introduced much later into the design. Already you can see parts of the final design in these work in progress photos, but as we move forward, we can see I was starting to introduce some of these trans dark blue pieces into the design. Originally, half of these were trans red so that it had that police lights aesthetic, very similar to the inspiration from the start of the video, but I just didn't really like how those looked, so I canned it and just decided to stick purely with trans dark blue pieces instead. Annoyingly, I was pretty happy with how this leg design looked, but I quickly realized that if I was to keep it, it didn't really fit with the overall proportions. This upper leg design here was a little bit too long, so unfortunately that one had to go as well, but I did really like how it looked. Also at this point, I started to introduce blue into the color scheme. I was getting some advice from different friends, and they remarked that it was kind of bland if it was just purely black and white, and I totally agreed with them. So I decided to introduce blue, and I think that was the right call. Also at this point, I realized just how bulky the upper arms were, and the fact that it was kind of repeating these same curve slope pieces that are on the torso. I don't know, it just didn't sit well with me. It looked like the same chest muscles were in the arms. It was just weird. So I realized those needed to go, and maybe they needed to be a little bit less bulky, because then he was starting to look a bit too much like a beefcake, you know? After slimming him down a little bit, we can see a much more simplified arm design, which is pretty much just your basic CCBS bones and shells, but it gets the job done. I also then built these shorter legs, and these fit with the overall proportions a little bit more, and I was still pretty happy with this design as well. You can also see where I started to add a bit more of a pronounced crotch on the mock here. I was speaking to Alex Mox, I have a link to his stuff in the description below, he's a very talented builder, and he was telling me about having more of a noticeable sort of divide between the chest, the waist, and the crotch. It just helps the mock look more visually pleasing and helps you understand the anatomy a little bit more when you're looking at it. So I listened to this advice and began to play with this, but it still didn't quite look right. We came down to the conclusion that the CCBS armor piece on the torso was the biggest issue, so I removed that entirely and started to play a bit more with system focus pieces to get a whole new chest area there. On top of that, I also redid the waist after getting a bit of advice from Cody Avery, and he explained how with people, our rib cages are angled down and forward, but the hips are angled down and backwards. Illustrating this on a bionicle or any sort of humanoid character for that matter helps to create a bit of flow and curvature, because it kind of mimics the S-curve of a spine and just how it normally looks, sort of thing. Yeah, as you can see from this sketch that he provided me with here. So I listened to that fantastic advice from Cody and really began to play with things so that it was not as rigid and not as stiff looking, I suppose. And having that kind of more curved waist there, I think was a good call. I did play with how I wanted to position that sort of triangular slope piece there, and ended up with how it looks now. Pretty much the bulk of the mock was done at this point, but people were recommending that I still add a few more colors to the color scheme. They were recommending orange or dark azure, for example, but I realized if I was to add a little bit of trans orange to the color scheme, then I'd have all the correct colors for the Ice Planet LEGO theme. So I tested that out, and I was very happy with how it looked. And then I just added a few other sort of nice details like a trans orange chainsaw, which you have to have if you're building an Ice Planet mock, and then these skates and a few other nice little things, accessories, all that sort of stuff, and the mock was basically done at that point. I mean, one final touch that I did do was another recommendation from Alex Mox. He was saying, what if I flipped the leg armor to the way that it looks now? And yeah, that was definitely the right call. I think that made it look way better. And with that, the mock was done. This MOC had a lot of trial and error within building it, and it was very helpful to be listening to the advice of so many creative, very talented builders to help me produce what I'm actually very proud of. So definitely recommend doing that in the future, listening to what other people's criticisms are and what they have to say, because it can certainly create a much better product if you follow through with what other people are saying. I thought it was also really cool how that sort of happy accident formed as I was building this, when I suddenly realized, hey, I can actually make this an ice planet MOC, and I had no plans to do that at the beginning. It was just a nice sort of turn of events. You know, when you do listen to those creative impulses and say yes, you can get some awesome results. So that was a good lesson when I was building this, that's for sure. Let's take a deep dive now into some of the smaller details of this MOC. Here's the MOC next to an Ice Planet minifigure, and you can see some of the key details like the ice skates or the trans orange chainsaw, and these are pretty key parts of both the minifigures and the sets themselves, so including them was certainly vital, at least in my opinion. It was also nice to use the Brain Attack Stormer helmet so that I could put that trans orange visor over the top to kind of mimic the helmet that you typically see on these minifigures. If you're curious about that chainsaw design, here's how I built it. It's very system heavy, but it uses pretty much just a bunch of repeated sections, and these sections are made up with these white Travis bricks, the sort of snot bricks with studs on all the sides, and then a few of these 1x1 plates in white, and then you just sort of layer the outside with trans orange plates and a few cheese slopes as well. But then the bottom layer, instead of using those plates, you turn it into some of these hollow studs here with the hole through the middle, and then you put a bar through it there so that you can actually connect it onto the CCBS shell. It's a pretty simple design, but I guess it's a nice fitting way of translating that weapon piece into bionicle form. And hey, if you want to build it or change up the colors or whatever, you're more than welcome to do so. I was also very happy with the articulation on the lower leg design of this MOC. Here's how it moves here as well. It's actually pretty sturdy, thankfully. It does break occasionally, but only if you handle it a little bit too hard, but otherwise it's a pretty sturdy design. Let me show you how this was specifically built as well. This design's a nice way of not having any ball and socket connections, but still having a good range of movement, and with the sturdiness of it, I'm most likely going to be using it again in future MOCs. Very, very happy with how this turned out. Now, while I show you this, let me also stress one really important thing that I learnt when making this MOC, and that's posing and presentation. So when I was photographing this, it took me 3 separate photo shoots to get the posing just right. The way your camera captures a MOC can really just make or break the MOC. Getting the posing just the way you want it to be can really help communicate who the character is, how they move, and just, I don't know, who they are, and so much more. Plus, I think there's so many MOCs out there that would look way better if they were just posed or photographed in a different way. It's kind of insane how much it can actually impact the look of it. I mean, when you think about it, we as humans are instinctively trained to read body language. The slightest head movement or the tiniest smile can communicate so much about a person. So you need to remember this and factor that in when you're photographing your MOC. Does the slightest head tilt or the specific pose that they're in, does that miscommunicate something that you don't want to be communicated when you're presenting your MOC? Or are you hiding some of the really cool techniques or details that you have with it? Yeah, you just got to factor all that stuff in when you're photographing any kind of bionicle or construction MOC. As I found too, sometimes you can take a photo that you're very happy with, and then suddenly in post when you're editing it, you're like, wait a minute, the fingers are just off and they look a bit weird. I got to rephotograph it because I'm not happy with how that looks. Oh, and if you're curious, by the way, I used flash photography with my DSLR Nikon camera, and these are some flash photography lights that I bought on Amazon. They weren't necessarily cheap, but they were a brilliant investment, and I'd happily buy them again if I needed to. But these are Godox SK400 lights, if you're interested in buying some yourself. So all in all, this was super fun to build, and it was great to build something for HF Feb and fit in with that nice community spirit, you know? Now, big thanks as well to all of the EP Lug friends who helped give me advice while I was building this. I very much appreciate the insight that you gave me. And hey, hopefully in future, some of these instructions and the other insights into my process here can help you with MOCs that you're going to be building and photographing. And hopefully too, you build something for HF Feb, because it's good fun. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, happy building, and bye for now.